Tremendous turnout. Today is actually part of a continuing series of webinars where we're hearing from impacted countries. Past webinars, we've also heard from Cuba, Gaza, Syria, Zimbabwe, and a number of other countries. And we plan future continuing webinars from the Sanctions Kill campaign. So welcome to today's program, The World Stands Up to Sanctions. This is an international webinar sponsored by the Sanctions Kill campaign. I'm Sarah Flounders, and I am so honored to chair today's panel. I help to coordinate the International Action Center and the United National Anti-War Coalition. I'm a contributing editor to Workers' World newspaper, but really most important for today, I help to coordinate the Sanctions Kill campaign, along with several other folks who you will meet today. This is a collective effort. For over 2 years, the Sanctions Kill campaign has mounted an international campaign with thousands of supporters in many languages. It's a campaign to first get many solidarity committees talking to each other and working together to collectively explain and to focus world attention on the most brutal form of economic strangulation, more deadly than bombs. Sanctions have been imposed on more than 40 countries by the United States, more than a third of the world population, in order to create dissent, hyperinflation, chronic shortages, and push for coups and destabilizations. It's an effort to restrict development for that third of the world's global population. 2 years ago, we put out a desperate alert as it was clear that the pandemic raised the danger of sanctions to a new level. Vaccine apartheid in Africa, in Latin America, a priority for profits, patents, and corporate monopolies, allowed the virus to spread and to mutate. But for over 40 sanctioned countries, they actually faced the denial of US and COVAX vaccines. How brutal is that? The Biden administration came in with grand promises to re-examine sanctions and the Trump foreign policy. Instead, this administration is doubling down on every Trump measure. The Treasury Department had even more devastating plans for harsher sanctions on Cuba, Venezuela, Syria, new threats on Russia, new sanctions on Nicaragua, provoking now an international crisis over the continued expansion of NATO to the very borders of Russia, new military threats against China, new conditions on Iran, continuing war in Syria, naval blockades and sanctions on Yemen continuing, new threats on Korea. This is not what was promised or expected. New sanctions on Ethiopia, Cambodia, intensified sanctions on Mali, and a more calculated corporate role for billionaires to use Facebook for coups and color revolutions, to use internet shutdowns to isolate, to restrict and prevent every spare part and every form of technology cutoff through sanctions. We could look at the US complete collapse in Afghanistan and then consciously stripping the cupboards bare, every dollar, food, and essential medicine seized and taken out of the country, including Afghanistan's own meager funds frozen. So as we are working together and combining our efforts against this monstrous, expanding crime, we've seen an exciting new development. A whole number of sanctioned countries, in order to survive, are consciously cooperating with each other. They're refusing economic siege warfare, isolation, and systemic starvation of their populations. There's resistance on a new and creative level, and that's what we're going to be looking at today. China with new trade and Belt and Road development for Nicaragua, with Venezuela playing a crucial role, in oil with Iran, with Russia and China providing aid to Syria to rebuild, even as US bombs continue, and Syria in turn sending oil to Lebanon to keep its hospitals running. The countries of Africa no longer face sanctions in isolation. They have other options now for economic development. This is a political and economic process that's just beginning. The big difference is that no country is standing alone against the US monolith. Every country is learning new forms, whether it's urban agriculture, greenhouses, survival techniques, and exchanges with each other. Our efforts too are only beginning because we need to do so much more in this interconnected world to defend every one of these sanctioned countries. So today, let's begin our program. We're going to begin, and we're very glad to do so, with Carlos Ron, who is a Venezuelan vice minister for North America. Venezuela is the fifth most sanctioned country by the United States, and Carlos Ron, I think we all know so well here in the US, where he's often participated. So Carlos, we give you the floor.
Well, thank you very much, Sarah, and it's a great pleasure for me to be here today with all of you and see familiar faces. I see my friend Francisco Campbell from Nicaragua, who I haven't seen in a while. And I'm very happy to be here. And again, it's a very important gathering as we stand together against the use of this weapon, which is the use of the illegal coercive measures, as they are called. But you know, sanctions is the word that the United States likes to use. But as we all know, the only legal sanctions acceptable throughout the world are the ones that are issued by the United Nations Security Council, and this is not the case. The United States has a unilateral and illegal policy which uses basically to coerce other governments into accepting or changing their own policies and to comply with the intentions that the United States has on those countries. Venezuela, since 1999, has been subjected to a hybrid war. And this means that this is a war by all types of aggressions, from the military aggressions that we have seen, like attempted coups and other attacks. There was in more recent times a drone attack against President Maduro in 2018, attempted blackout against the whole country, mercenary invasions, and therefore and so forth. But this is just part of a whole other group of actions, including legal indictments, including a media narrative that questions Venezuela's democratic practices, including a political recognition of a man who a day like today, 3 years ago, claimed to be the president of Venezuela, and after that has just unleashed another set of sanctions and unilateral measures against Venezuela. But specifically, we want to talk about the effect and the aggression that has been set against Venezuela with the use of those illegal measures, those measures that basically attack Venezuela's financial, economic system and access to the international financial system. Like Sarah said before, we are the fifth most sanctioned country in the world by the United States. We have, this has been done through 2 laws and 7 executive orders. But basically, this has, the implication of this is that we have over $7 billion frozen in bank accounts. It's $30 billion of assets altogether that Venezuela could use or should use for its necessities and such as combating the pandemic, and we cannot do it because these are under these illegal measures. Over 190 officials or persons related to the Venezuelan governments have been sanctioned by the United States with personal actions. 153 businesses, 10 of them state-owned, but the rest is in the private sector. And the list can go on. I could tell you about 69 ships, 30 oil tankers, 58 airplanes, and much more. But in essence, you have taken away from a country like Venezuela the capability to interact in the international financial system by blocking bank transactions, by freezing its accounts, by prohibiting the commercialization of its main resources like oil or gold, by banning any type of transactions related to debt. So any other country can simply renegotiate or restructure its debts in foreign banks. Venezuela cannot do that. But Venezuela has also seen measures taken against the food program, the subsidized food program distribution called CLAP, which is Committees for Local Supply and Production. We've seen our maritime fleet, our ships, like I said before, are being blocked. But we've seen shipments coming to Venezuela being stopped by the United States and being even taken, as we saw in the case of some ships coming from Iran with fuel and for other materials to ease our oil production, that they have been taken, and the contents of those ships coming to Venezuela have been sold off as if we were talking about pirates in the Caribbean in several centuries ago. Conviasa, which is Venezuela's flag airline, has also been sanctioned. And this is critical in the time that the sanction came into place in the middle of the pandemic, after we have been using this airline as part of the program to repatriate some of our migrants who have been to other countries, who in the middle of their stay in other countries saw the necessity to come back because, first of all, they were tricked, or they were held there for different reasons other than what they expected. And then when they needed to come back, the Venezuelan government offered the opportunity to do so free of charge through the Venezuelan airline, but that was also sanctioned, and some of those trips have been impossible to carry out any longer because of those measures taken against the airline. You have to think about what these sanctions, what these actions do to a country, specifically in the sense of the maintenance of the public services in the country, when most of the technology and most of the equipments belong to other to technologies foreign from Venezuela. For example, here, electricity, the companies that would come to Venezuela and do maintenance and or spare parts that we need to make sure that the electricity runs appropriately, well, that is affected by these measures. And besides all these specific measures that I spoke, I think one last thing, I know we have a small framework of time, but I want to make sure that everybody here understands that there's also the issue of overcompliance with the use of sanctions. And overcompliance means that many companies or many other actors will not trade with Venezuela, will not sell Venezuela things it needs, because they're afraid of what consequences there may be to them because of the U.S. sanctions. Not because they're listed, not because they're specifically stated, but because they fear what other actions can be taken. So these companies come into this overcompliance. See, technically, for example, Venezuela could be, Venezuela should be able to access food and medicine outside, because they should not be under any of the sanction regime policies. But in truth, in reality, a lot of the companies don't want to sell to Venezuela, or don't want to provide these items to Venezuela because they fear what other what things may happen to them. And just to give you an example, this is not me speaking on this, but if you see letters that have been written on this issue by senators, by representatives of the U.S. Congress, you can very well see where this is mentioned. And I'll give you one brief statement from one of these letters in February of 2021, a letter signed by members of Congress, including Representative Amare, where it says, dozen members of Congress expressed great concern to the previous administration about the way that the US sanctions were hampering a global response to both the public health crisis and the economic crisis perpetuated by the COVID-19 pandemic. Existing protocols and licenses have proved woefully insufficient to meet the enormity of the challenges shared by the people around the world in the face of the pandemic. Even when licenses and humanitarian exemptions are available, moreover, there is a persistent problem of overcompliance, particularly from the financial sector. This has led to catastrophic humanitarian consequences in various parts of the world. These are US Congress members speaking. This is not me. This is not somebody from, an anti-US organization. This is the truth being spoken by those who, in a way, participate also in the perpetration of these attacks on our countries. So, in sum, my dear friends, I think it's very important, and of course we're open to speak more detail about what happens in Venezuela. But I think it's very important that we must stand against the use of this weapon that sanctions are now. This is worse, like Sarah said, this is worse. This is the same as warfare. This is just another type of warfare, but we have deaths that could be attributed to the imposition of these measures. And I think all peoples around the world should stand and should denounce the seriousness of these policies and should stand together in order to counteract them. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Carlos. That was really incredible. And I do want to ask each of the panelists to stay on for the question and answer period and to share this. It's streaming on the Facebook of Sanctions Kill. Share it with your sites, send a tweet, encourage others to join, and you will also receive after this program a YouTube video of the program. And we're next, very honored, we're going to hear from Francisco Campbell, who is the Nicaraguan ambassador to the US. Nicaragua joins the countries under some of the harshest sanctions after their democratic elections. And they're also choosing a new road of survival so that they are not isolated in the world. So Francisco Campbell, please join us. And I think you need to unmute. Great. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here with you. And I want to say hello to my good friend, Carlos. The heightened hostility and systematic aggression of the United States and its imperialist allies against the people of Nicaragua is the continuation of a policy carried out against our country throughout history, and a reminder that interventionism in Nicaragua is one of the most persistent manifestations of US foreign policy in the Western Hemisphere. As early as 1823, when the United States enacted the Monroe Doctrine, its guiding policy framework to exert influence in Latin America and the Caribbean, interventionism in the affairs of Nicaragua became a constant of US policy. From the signing of the Clayton-Bulwer Treaty of 1850 regarding control of the proposed Nicaragua Canal, to outright recognition in 1856 of William Walker, a US mercenary, as president of Nicaragua, who went on to reinstate slavery and seek annexation to the United States. This interventionist policy included deployment of Marines to overthrow President Jose Santos Elias in 1910 and military assistance to conservative General Emiliano Chamorro in the 1912 assassination of General Benjamin Celedón, who had opposed US interference in Nicaragua. United States Marines occupied Nicaragua from 1912 until 1933, when they were expelled by our national hero, the General of Freemen, Augusto Calderón Sandino, who was assassinated in an ignominious act of betrayal by General Anastasio Somoza Garcia in 1934 with the permission and backing of the US ambassador at the time. The brutal Somoza dictatorship had the full support of every US president from Franklin Roosevelt to Jimmy Carter. All of these presidents, Democrats and Republicans, turned a blind eye to the gross human rights violations committed by the dictator and facilitated the looting of the natural resources of the country, along with exploitation of the vast majority of the people. After 43 years of terror and systematic human rights violations, the Somoza dictatorship finally came to an end when his National Guard was defeated by the Sandinista revolution in 1979, marking the beginning of democracy in Nicaragua for the first time in the history of the country. This revolutionary democratic victory for the people of Nicaragua was soon subverted when US interventionism returned in the form of the Contra War that caused over 50,000 deaths and completely destroyed the economy, along with systematic interference since 1990 in the Nicaragua electoral processes through corrupt, anti-democratic, and blatantly illegal practices. Immediately following the victory of Comandante Daniel Ortega and the FSLN in the 2006 elections, the US government renewed its aggression against Nicaragua in the form of financial, technical, and intelligence assets and resources amounting to several $100 million that were channeled through a few dozen individuals and local NGOs for the purpose of establishing anti-Sandinista and anti-government media structures and campaign to instigate dissent and violence in urban and rural areas, as well as advocate for illegal and unilateral measures against the Nicaraguan people in flagrant violation of Nicaragua laws and basic principles of international law. The 2018 coup attempt was the culmination of this policy of aggression. It cost the lives of 198 Nicaraguan sisters and brothers and countless others injured. 1 in 4 small businesses were closed because of the impact that barricading of roads and highways had on the economy. 98,000 jobs were lost, and the overall damage to the national economy was estimated at over US $27 billion. The people of Nicaragua were able to defeat the coup by calling to memory the shared history of struggle against US interventionism. The profound sense of national dignity, patriotism, and pride was in full display against this new attempt by the local oligarchy and US neocolonialists to subjugate Nicaragua. The Nicaragua model of participatory democracy, the people president, proved its mettle in this most recent confrontation and has been strengthened through the celebration of regional elections in 2019 and national elections in November of last year. Overcoming the effects of the coup attempt, Nicaragua has returned to the path of integral, comprehensive economic growth, maintaining key social programs that have allowed the country to reduce poverty, ensure free and universal quality health care and education, citizen security, and food sovereignty. The building of infrastructure in the form of highways, hospitals, and schools, as well as access to basic services, reducing vulnerability to the worsening effects of climate change, all attest to the growing strength and resilience of the Nicaragua model of human development and participatory democracy, which ensures that all sectors of society have a voice in the building of a more prosperous and diverse nation, aiming to eradicate poverty, hunger, and inequality, and prioritizing gender equity in all areas as one of its foundational components. Nicaragua is the best performing Central American country in terms of handling of the COVID-19 pandemic, which is a direct result of Comandante Ortega's commitment to ensure access to free, quality healthcare services for all, and a reflection of the confidence the Nicaraguan people have in their family and community-centered health model. As an expression of the steadfast and unwavering determination to defend and exercise our right to national sovereignty, self-determination, and independence, Nicaragua has reestablished ties with the People's Republic of China, a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, and began the process of withdrawing from the Organization of American States. These strategic decisions will undoubtedly open new avenues and possibilities for Nicaragua to move ahead in its commitment to achieve integral, comprehensive development with social justice for all. Because of these achievements and the good example they represent, Nicaragua is seen as a threat to U.S. foreign policy that through illegal, coercive, and unilateral measures seeks to perpetuate neocolonial domination and exploitation. As of 2022, almost 2 billion people from over 40 countries are being denied the right to development due to these illegal sanctions, which in times of pandemic and as we grapple with the effects of climate change is nothing short of a crime against humanity. Nicaragua maintains that the only legal sanctions are those of the United Nations Security Council and has demanded that all unilateral, coercive, and illegal measures imposed on our countries or on any other country be immediately eliminated. The firm pronouncement that sanctions still must be made to resonate loudly throughout the world because of the immense suffering and destruction they are causing. It is imperative that all sanctions be eliminated, allowing our countries the space and resources needed to effectively address the myriad of challenges to overcome in our efforts to build more just and fair societies with opportunities and benefits for all. This is the purpose and goal of the successful Nicaragua participatory democracy model, also known as the People President, that was reaffirmed by the overwhelming vote of the Nicaraguan people in the November 7 election, granting a new 5-year term, which formally began this past January 10th, when President Ortega and Vice President Murillo were sworn into office. The struggle continues, and we are confident that justice in the end will prevail. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Francisco Campbell. We will next be joined by Deacon Yoseph Teferi. So please do turn on your mic. Ethiopia, he's chair of the Ethiopian American Civic Council. Ethiopia is now entering the countries facing sanctions and US destabilization. And just before Deacon Yoseph speaks, we are asking people to use the Q&A function, the chat function when there's really hundreds of participants, and there are today who have signed on. The chat becomes a very difficult function to keep going. Works very well in a small meeting, but not in a very large meeting with so many viewers. And if you're on Facebook, do share the stream that is coming from the Sanctions Kill Facebook. So Deacon Yoseph Teferi, please.
Thank you for having me to join this seminar. This is an extraordinary opportunity for us, not only to share our concern currently unfolding in Ethiopia, but also learn ways that how we can be able to mitigate the impact of possible sanctions against Ethiopia, and actually for the region. I believe Eritrea was one of the countries that had been affected by sanction severely over the last 30 years. So this is, and I'm honored to be here today. Ethiopian American Civic Council is an organization. It's a civic organization established. This is our 7th year. We engaged essentially our constituent of Ethiopian Americans to be able to civically engage and thereby gain their own political capital to deal with concerns that we have not only here domestic in our own region where we live, but also of the state of Ethiopia. We were able to pass HR 128 in 2018 that culminated the upheaval in Ethiopia at the time. By the way, HR 128 is probably one of the first African congressional resolution that passed that became quite consequential for bringing down a very notorious
Thank you. We're next going to hear from Erica Jung, who is with Nodutdol, Korean grassroots organization of diasporic Koreans and comrades based in indigenous lands known as the United States and Canada. Nodutdol organizes for a world free of imperialism and for Korea's reunification and national liberation.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And a big thank you to the Sanctions Kill campaign on behalf of Nodutdol for organizing this event. It's a pleasure to be here among all of you to talk about such an important topic. On December 13th, the Biden administration symbolically agreed to an end of war declaration. And while we welcome gestures like this, the US has in the meantime failed to address any of the conditions that North Korea had asked for, such as lifting certain sanctions and stopping military exercises. Instead, the US continues to employ sanctions and isolation tactics against North Korea, undermining the country's sovereignty and subjecting its 25 million people to a brutal siege that has lasted for decades. Just 3 days prior to this, the Biden administration announced a new round of sanctions, targeting individuals and entities in North Korea, as well as China, Bangladesh, Russia, and Myanmar on December 10th, 2021, the 73rd anniversary of Human Rights Day. Biden argued that North Korea's nuclear and missile program continues to constitute an unusual and extraordinary threat to the national security, foreign policy, and economy of the United States. Now, let us review in US-Korean relations who is the real threat. The US during the Korean War killed 3 to 5 million Koreans. This is a number that amounts to genocide. The US dropped more aerial bombs on North Korea than it did in the entire Pacific theater of World War II. And to this day, the Korean War is not over. The ceasefire signed in 1953 did not end the war. In fact, the US kept almost 1,000 nuclear missiles in South Korea pointed at the North for nearly 50 years. To this day, the US occupies the South with almost 30,000 troops and regularly conducts military exercises that rehearse invasions of the North with as many as 300,000 soldiers at a time. Now, in this context, the North Korean development of nuclear weapons is a strategy of deterrence against the threat of US imperialist aggression. North Korea can't trade with other countries, receive international loans, or import fuel or much of anything else. Sanctions impact the daily life of all North Koreans. From agriculture to industry and medicine, they impact everything. Most things North Koreans need, they have to produce for themselves. There is no getting it from somewhere else. Sanctions impact water, sanitation, hygiene, and healthcare infrastructure. According to UNICEF, over 9.75 million people do not have access to safely managed drinking water. And one of the many types of items that North Korea is banned from importing due to sanctions is water sanitation equipment. Under sanctions, seeds, fertilizers, and agricultural equipment and other types of machinery are banned. And contrary to popular narratives that claim North Korea's government is intentionally withholding food from its population, food insecurity in the country is driven by lack of access to modern agricultural equipment and techniques. And this is further amplified by natural disasters and the impacts of climate change. In fact, North Korea has a public food distribution system, but it's unable to access the necessary agricultural imports from the world market. Sanctions also hugely affect the quality of healthcare available in North Korea. While the country has a national public healthcare system that provides medical care to everyone free of charge, and its health indicators are much higher than in countries with comparably sized economies. Because of sanctions, North Korea's healthcare system faces shortages of medicine and equipment that impact its ability to treat many preventable diseases. This is the reason why, for instance, up to 37% of deaths among children under 5 are caused by pneumonia and diarrhea. Under UN sanctions, all metal items are banned. Think about what that means. Metal is everywhere. Sterilizers, ambulances, medical appliances, X-ray machines, operating tables, hospital beds, water filters, metal tubes, pipes, pipe fittings, the list is endless. And it's these kind of items that could be used to prevent and treat common health problems in North Korea. If the basis of sanctions and US aggression against North Korea is really a concern for human rights, one might wonder why these sanctions seem to so obviously trample on North Koreans' right to live. While the UN makes exemptions on a case-by-case basis for humanitarian aid, applicants for these exemptions, mainly international and non-governmental organizations, face significant challenges, from long wait times for review and approval of exemption requests to unrealistic shipping requirements. These administrative barriers to humanitarian aid have had fatal consequences. In just 2018, delays and funding shortfalls resulted in an estimated 3,968 preventable deaths. The US condemns human rights in North Korea, yet in the same breath, it violates these very rights by imposing deadly sanctions. The US claims to want to end the Korean War, yet in the same breath, the US imposes greater sanctions as an act of warfare, knowing full well that North Korea sees lifting sanctions as a precondition to negotiations in ending the war. We must not be fooled by the rhetoric of the United States, but look instead at its actions. Despite these repressive US policies, however, North Korea has resisted sanctions and managed to hold its own. North Korea has persevered through hardship and shown remarkable strength and determination in overcoming these many challenges. Since the arduous March, a time of famine in the 90s, the country has been gradually recovering, having developed its own technology and infrastructure to rebuild, feed, and clothe its people. Its development model is centered around the Juche ideology, which emphasizes self-reliance, self-sufficiency, and self-confidence. The North Korean people continue to stay resilient and adapt to the many challenges they face through remarkable advancements in agriculture, energy, and textile and steel production. It has resisted sanctions by investing in industries that they are otherwise cut off from. Through carbon chemistry, North Korea has created their own gasoline, synthetic resins, synthetic rubber, agricultural pesticides, paints, medicines, chemical fertilizers, and more. These are all products that are typically made through petrochemistry with oil. And though North Korea cannot access oil, it has found other ways to provide for its people. They are adapting their lives because of sanctions, in acts of resistance and survival, as the national ideology of Juche manifests itself in all parts of the North Korean economy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Erica. Thank you. And I first want to apologize to Deacon Yoseph. It seems that some of his talk cut off in the end, and when we go into question and answer, there's can be drops when we're doing things on the internet. When we go into the Q&A, he'll have really additional time to speak. It's complicated to do these programs, and yet we continue. Our next speaker will be Elias Amare, who is an Eritrean American journalist. He is the Horn of Africa TV editor and the founder of Peace Building in the Horn of Africa. And so we turn it over to you. And we will have an additional speaker after this that we're bringing in a unique way. So Elias Amare, please.
Thank you very much, our founders and the Sanctions Coalition, for inviting us to to bring forth the plight of our people, the Eritrean people, suffering from economic warfare imposed by imperialism, by US imperialism. It would be great if we could eliminate or scrap off the usage of the word sanctions, because, well, one of great writer George Orwell, in his essay Politics in the English Language, says how language is used by, aggressors to camouflage brutality. So collateral damage, which is really the massacre of civilians, becomes, a nicely sounding phrase called collateral damage. And sanctions is in that kind of category of vitiation. What it really is economic warfare on people, strangulation of a nation's economy. So it would be really nice if we can do away with the use of the euphemism called sanctions and just call it a spade, call it by its name, economic warfare. Unfortunately, however, it has been in use for such a long time to hoodwink people that we, those of us who suffer from it, from economic warfare, unknowingly call it sanctions. So whenever we say sanctions, it means economic warfare, war on the people. And war is war, as Gramsci says, whether it's economic warfare or brutal direct warfare or asymmetric warfare or information, psychological warfare. The end game is the same, to brutally crush resisting people to submission. That is what is happening to my people, Eritrean people in the Horn of Africa. This is not the first time that sanctions were imposed on us. Previous sanctions were imposed on Eritrea actually under the rubric of the UN Security Council. So even at the UN Security Council, unjust, illegitimate sanctions could be imposed. How were they imposed on Eritrea, these unjust sanctions at the UN Security Council? Well, in 2009, the regional proxy regime on the Horn of Africa, called the TPLF minority regime, at that time empowering Ethiopia, ignited a war on Eritrea under the pretext of a border, but largely because Eritrea did not submit to the diktats of the empire. It wanted to chart its own independent national path, self-reliance. It rejected foreign aid. It kicked out eventually the US aid because Eritrea realized the US aid was up to no good. US aid is just a front organization for the CIA, as renowned international law professor Francis Boyle coiled it. So for these reasons, Eritrea was punished and a war was waged on it by a regional proxy force, the TPLF minority regime. It is now kicked out of power by popular uprising in Ethiopia. But at that time, the TPLF regime was ruling Ethiopia for 27 years, from 1991 up to 2018. And it brought much misery on the people of Ethiopia, to the minority regime. So it was minority rule under the guise of ethnic federalism, but tribalism essentially, whereby a minority can impose its rule over the rest, the majority of the Ethiopian people. It waged war on Somalia, and because Eritrea opposed the invasion of Somalia in 2006, 2007, as punishment, Eritrea was put under sanctions regime or economic warfare at the UN Security Council. This was due to the US engineered or machinations of the United States If you examine WikiLeaks documents of that period, say from 2006 up to 2011, you will see all the secret meetings between then Ambassador Susan Rice at the United Nations and the Ethiopian dictator Meles Zenawi, how they conspire, they planned for the sanctions to be imposed on Eritrea. Another border conflict was manufactured with small neighboring country, Djibouti, also to ramp up the other bogus charge that Eritrea helped the Al-Shabaab terrorists in Somalia. This was preposterous and utterly bogus, because anyone who knows the struggle, the Eritrean revolution and Eritrean's long struggle, knows that Eritrea is against terrorism. In fact, it was the victim of terrorism, jihadi extremist terrorism. This is amply witnessed by facts. In 1997, for example, these proxy jihadi groups killed 5 Belgian tourists in Eritrea. In 2006, British geologists doing exploration, mining exploration in a remote part of Eritrea. His name is Gordon, was killed by these jihadi terrorist elements. So Eritrea suffered from terrorism. So how was it possible to support Al-Shabaab? They manufacture the evidence. They are the judges. They bring false witnesses. They bring, of course, puppet African regimes and through the African Union. This bogus charge then was brought to the United Nations Security Council. And, you know, the others went along with this. Fortunately, Russia at that time did not veto. It went along with the vote. China abstained. And so we suffered alone. And from 2009 up to 2018, we were alone in the wilderness fighting this unjust sanctions at the UN Security Council. So even at the United Nations Security Council, sometimes there are exceptions where illegal and unjust sanctions can be imposed on a country that refuses to submit to the diktats of the empire. And for 9 years, Eritrea suffered alone. They tried to isolate us. They tried to demonize the president of the country, the Eritrean Defense Forces. Bogus human rights charges were brought against Eritrea in Geneva, the UN Human Rights Council. So the empire basically can do what it wants. It's the Thucydides dictum of imperialists. What was it that the Greek historian Thucydides wrote in the Peloponnesian War, where the Athenians is the famous the Melian dialogue, where the Athenian imperialists go to this tiny island, Milos, and they want to crush it. People of Milos try to reason with them. This is unjust, this is unfair, it is against the will of the gods, and so on and so forth. Finally, the Athenians, in utter arrogance and hubris, say, this is a famous quote, "The strong do as they can, and the weak suffer what they must." And so they destroyed Milos. This was 2,300, 2,400 years ago. The same, hubris of empire is like that. Empires come and empires go. The current empire now, imperialism, is doing this sanctions, this economic warfare against peoples of the global south. Like we heard from the esteemed ambassador of Nicaragua, the esteemed ambassador, minister from Venezuela, from the young lady from Korea, that countries that refuse to submit to the diktats of the empire, that want to go to chart their own path of economic development, of self-reliance, of progressive, non-aligned politics are essentially punished through these sanctions, economic warfare. You crush the countries from achieving development. You isolate them, you demonize them, and you strangle the economy of the people. You make their economy scream, as Nixon once said when President Nixon and Foreign Secretary of State Kissinger were conspiring to punish Chile under President Salvador Allende in the early 1970s. These were the words of President Nixon, secretly recorded, of course, but later became public. Said, make the economy scream. So it's to make the economy of countries like Nicaragua, like Venezuela, like Eritrea scream, to punish the people to starvation, to deny them of medical supplies, and so on and so forth, until people suffer. And the intention is what? The people will suffer and then rise up and overthrow this legitimate governments. This is what the economic warfare in a nutshell was aimed at. But anyway, from 2009 up to 2018, Eritrea struggled. Eventually, inside Ethiopia, the proxy regime of the TPLF, that was the trusted ally of the United States and the West, was overthrown when the people have had enough. The Ethiopian people rose up in a popular protest for 3-4 years. And eventually, this minority regime was kicked out of power. So it was only when this regime was kicked out of power, and there are so many regimes like that, by the way. Comrades from Nicaragua and Venezuela will attest to this. In Latin America, there are so many proxy regimes that disrupt progress there, disrupt good progressive countries like Venezuela, like Nicaragua. We know, we follow what goes on there. So Nicaragua now finally had to withdraw from the regional organization called OAS, the Organization of American States. Why? Because OAS is just a puppet of the North American empire. We have a similar situation in Africa, where the African Union essentially is just a toothless, servant of the empire. These regional organizations, whether in Africa or Latin America, do not serve the interests of people. When unjust sanctions or economic warfare is being conducted on countries, they either cheer on or they support it. So we salute Nicaragua for taking this brave stand. We stand in solidarity with all the people suffering from unjust economic warfares of the empire, whether it is in Latin America or in Asia or in the Middle East or in Africa. Currently, our neighbor Ethiopia, with whom Eritrea has finally made peace once the puppet proxy regime of the TPLF was overthrown from power, the conflict between the two countries was resolved quickly. But the empire doesn't sleep. It wants to resuscitate this trusted former proxy regime of the TPLF. And in November 2020, a year ago, the TPLF regime from its Tigray province in the north once again unleashed war on Ethiopia and Eritrea also. So under this circumstance, both Eritrea and Ethiopia had to defend themselves against this aggression and crush this, outlaw terrorist force, which is destabilizing the entire Horn of Africa region. And once again, then the sanctions that were lifted from Eritrea in 2018, once peace was achieved with Ethiopia, because all the charges that were brought against Eritrea at the UN Security Council were proven to be false, and both Ethiopia and Somalia said these sanctions must be lifted. They are unjust. Eritrea is a force for stability in the region now. So finally, those sanctions, those UN Security Council sanctions that were engineered by the United States had to be lifted. There was no longer any excuse left. But then after a brief respite, recently also, last November, unilateral US sanctions or economic warfare was once again imposed on Eritrea. And we find ourselves again fighting and resisting this unjust economic warfare by the empire. And Ethiopia too is, as my brother from Ethiopia, Deacon Yoseph previously stated, sanctions are being threatened on it unless it submits to the diktats of the empire. The real reason why this economic warfare, this war on Horn of Africa is being conducted by the Biden administration or Biden regime is that a new era of Horn of Africa peace is about to be ushered in. The countries of the region being fed up of this constant interventionism, imperialist interventions, want to say enough. They are saying no more. We want peace and stability. We want to, cooperate ourselves within ourselves, establish economic integration, expand the peace to include other neighboring countries. So there was a good beginning between Eritrea, Ethiopia, and Somalia. And of course, imperialism doesn't like that. Once African countries begin to cooperate with themselves and begin the path of true development through self-reliance, rejecting foreign aid and dependency, what will happen? Well, the loot and plunder of African resources. Africa is a very rich continent, has all kinds of important minerals agriculture produce. So imperialism is going to be denied of these rich resources. Well, actually, no. We want to cooperate. It's not a zero-sum game. I heard in one talk, former CIA analyst Ray McGovern say, he told a story about him going to a nursery or kindergarten to attend for his grandson. And when he went there, he said he was puzzled that the children were playing without fighting, peacefully. He asked the teacher, how is it that the kids are behaving nicely? So she took me to a room, he says, she showed him a table, and she said, how many chairs do you see? He said 4. Okay, and how many toys on the table? He said 2. Well, that's how we teach the kids. Essentially, 4 kids sitting on a table have only 2 toys. So they are taught from an early age how to cooperate. And through cooperation, they share. And once they share, there is no fighting. And that's how you don't see fighting in this kindergarten, the teacher explained to him. So this is the kind of cooperation that should be, and this seminar is important because solidarity is important for countries facing unjust economic warfare.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And we want to, our apologies to Deacon Yoseph. Technology goes down sometimes. We wanted to ask him to complete his comments before we go into the Q&A and a few announcements. So you know, every one of these programs is a constant technical workaround. So Deacon Yoseph Teferi, let me ask you to finish your comments.
Okay. Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, very well.
Okay, good.
And
I'm glad.
sorry it dropped.
Yeah, bad network, and I apologize, Sarah. Okay, so I was, I guess, in the process of explaining who Ethiopian American Civic Council is, and we're a civic organization that represent close to about 1 million Ethiopian Americans here in the United States. But we start, even though that we focused on more constituent political campaigns that garnered us some support from congressional members that eventually became that we were able to draft and pass the first African resolution known as HR 128 that came at a very critical time of the recent Ethiopian politics. And that is when the Ethiopian people rose up and fought against this ethnic regime. Your previous guest was explaining this resolution that we sponsored sort of kind of created the perfect storm for the downfall of this regime in Ethiopia back in 2018. Really, one needs to look at critically the region at large in order to understand why the United States in this particular time is favoring TPLF, seems at least to favor TPLF. It is because of the Ethiopian strategic location on the Red Sea, and the finally been able to unite its overall national interest with that of Eritrea and also in Somalia, and I believe also South Sudan. So creating a sort of like a broader sense of confederation for all these countries to benefit from their natural resources, security arrangement, and become more or less truly independent countries. President Isaias is known to be a very, very independent leader. And so having the Red Sea in itself, they made sure that if he cannot be a yes man as the force that run the country of Ethiopia, TPLF, then they basically put him under a serious sanctions that lasted as long as the government of Eritrea has come to existence. And one can see the devastation that has caused. And now, you know, even in this current climate, what started it all is the fact that TPLF, after they've been removed from power 3 years ago, they decided that they are going to attack Ethiopia and Eritrea. And they essentially launched a rebel attack against the Ethiopian Northern Command that was located in the region where they are in power. And this kind of caused the cascading effect of the current conflict that we have today. Clearly, the United States came on the side of TPLF. And it's just one could see how we have been dragged into the United Nations Security Council almost a dozen times in a single calendar year for all sort of issues. And many congressional members and senators favoring TPLF. One, in fact, drafted a resolution citing that Ethiopia, in fact, has committed genocide against its own people. But Ethiopian American Civic Council with Senator Jim Inhofe of Oklahoma, together we campaigned very heavily, and we were successful in removing that provision out of a Pentagon appropriation bill for 2022. And having said that, what this indicates usually, sanction is usually a sign of a failed foreign policy. That's how you resort to that. So isn't actually declaring a war on a country. Usually when the foreign policies and diplomatic efforts fail, usually end up in resorting to that. Well, since sanction in essence is a form of war, a quiet war, and it is particularly waged against the ordinary people. It usually doesn't affect the leaders. And usually what happens in the case, for example, in Ethiopia, the African Growth Opportunity Act, AGOA, which Ethiopia benefited close to about $300 million of the tax-exempt export to the US. Ethiopia was removed at the end of December last year by President Biden from this Opportunity Act. So we feel that the situation, such as the attempt to classify Ethiopia as a country committed genocide, that usually is like a down payment for sanction to be declared in so many levels. And we're new to this. Ethiopia is new to this. Ethiopia traditionally has been an ally of a strategic ally of the United States. And since United States basically backed TPLF, the rebel group that attacked Ethiopia, Ethiopia was put under this vice, economic vice, and as such, in which we have never experienced before. We've seen it in other countries. And we know also the extent of how powerful, how devastating these measures are, because the United States does not seem to act alone. It has other international institutions that brings to bear. These financial institutions such as the World Bank, International Monetary Funds, even other countries and European countries, which seem to parallel their policies, economic policy in particular, with that of the United States. A country like Ethiopia really is, we are defenseless in terms of bearing the full threat of sanction by the United States. We work as a civic organization to have a better or a stronger bilateral relationship between Ethiopia and the United States. We have done, this relationship didn't start today. It has been for 118 years. As you know, Ethiopia has never been colonized. There are only about 2 or 3 countries on the entire world that have never been colonized, and that one is one happened to be Ethiopia. So what we are advising and campaigning and lobbying is by saying the United States, sanction will not work on a country that has never bowed down to foreign power, whether it is physically colonizing Ethiopia or subjecting to neo-colonial threats. So there has to be a better way of dealing, of wanting or getting what they seek, provided it is mutual, beneficiary for both countries, and that it respects the sovereignty of Ethiopia. And I think somebody mentioned earlier, which is, I believe is a good point, is, the days of superpower, as we know it, is quite numbered now. We can see the writing on the wall. There are other emerging powers coming in, and particularly these powers are highly creating a regional sphere of influence. And so when the United States uses a very forceful sanctional measure,
and if it fails to achieve what it tended to do, and it loses its leverage and influence in the region, that space that the United States vacate will not remain being in a vacuum. These other emerging powers are ready to occupy those space. So in the long term, sanctions don't work. And in fact, it works against the interest of the country that is actually using it as an instrument as a coercive measure. But until then, though, the devastation effect is quite staggering. The $300 million credit, the tax credit that AGOA was to provide to Ethiopia, creates near to about 1 million jobs directly and indirectly in Ethiopia. So when you remove that, at least that Opportunity Act, the impact is not on the leaders of the country, but it is the ordinary people that would lose their jobs. And we know all sanctions are not born equal. They have many steps and severity that they can bring on you. And therefore, we feel quite strong about advocating for a better way for the United States to engage with countries like Ethiopia and Eritrea, for that matter. So I am here more than anything is to learn from others' experience, since this is relatively a new phenomenon that is impacting Ethiopia. And I want to stop now by wanting to hear how others have coped with this. And we're Ethiopian Americans, so we benefit and advocate for having a better relationship between these two countries. And so, as you know, that we lobby, we have professional lobbying firms that we have hired. We, campaign with in Congress and the State Department to really to see to them that sanction is not a way to go about and achieving what they want. And we hope that they will heed our calls. And again, Sarah, thank you so much for the opportunity for me to speak a little that I know.
Thank you, Deacon Yoseph Teferi. Now, we have a very interesting challenge, and this shows how sanctions work in ways that sometimes you don't see around the world. There's an Iranian speaker that is next. However, US corporate power usually aligns with the US in acting and breaking not only supplies, but even internet connections. So our next speaker, Foad Izaadi, who is a professor at the University of Tehran, isn't able to join us on Zoom today. That's something that is often blocked from the US. Fearing that this might happen, we are determined always to do workarounds as the sanctioned countries themselves. In order to be self-reliant, they gotta constantly find workarounds to everything. So we did an interview with Foad Izaadi beforehand on Skype. Joe Lombardo arranged to do that interview. And we're gonna play that now because we refuse to allow voices to be silenced. And we want to say that this is part of what happens also. I think we've been on programs where a Palestinian speaker will suddenly Zoom directly cut the program, where Facebook has cut programs, where Twitter accounts with thousands of followers are suddenly just snipped. This is the way that US and its imperialist allies work to try to silence the people of the world. And we need to be determined to resist that silencing. So, Joe, I think this is an important lesson in sanctions. If you could please play the interview with Foad Izaadi. Thank you. And then we will go to a Q&A. We're running a little bit behind time, But really, this is such a wealth of information and material. And we also do want to say there are a number of questions asking, can this be rebroadcast? Yes. Do people have access to it? Yes. Well, I'll stop here. Thank you.
Generally, you don't match what we get in Iran in terms of
Can you hear now?
the next.
Yes, we can hear, but the video went down.
List of the most sanctioned countries is Korea, North Korea, and then
Thank
go
you.
down the list, other countries are also included. And I think you have panelists from these countries that are facing severe sanctions. With regard to Iran sanctions, as you know, there was a hope that through the nuclear agreement, at least some of these sanctions will go away. And that was signed in 2015 during the Obama presidency. And when Mr. Trump came into office about a year after his presidency, as you remember, in 2018, he left the agreement. And the current Biden administration is more or less following the lead of the previous administration, the Trump administration. Although they criticize President Trump for his Iran policy, they seem to be addicted to sanctions the same way that Trump was, and the same way other US government officials have been in the last number of decades towards Iran. And the current situation is that if a country wants to follow UN Resolution 2231, which is the UN resolution that brought the nuclear agreement as part of a UN document, and based on the UN Resolution 2231, countries are supposed to be able to trade with Iran freely, and interference in Iran's international economic trade is prohibited based on Article 26 of the nuclear agreement, which is UN Resolution 31. And what the United States government is doing is not only not following the UN resolution, the US government is actually punishing the countries that are trying to follow that UN resolution. So what the Trump administration did was to withdraw from the agreement, and they also said they will punish countries that engage with Iran, which is opposed to the UN resolution. So what the US is doing is actually breaking international law. In that sense, the United States is also breaking international law by violating other countries' sovereignty. Companies in Europe, Asia, or Africa, or Latin America are supposed to be free from interference from foreign government. If you dictate the law that is passed by the US Congress on companies of other countries, you are basically violating that country's sovereignty. And that's exactly what the US is doing. The US could dictate American companies, I guess, in terms of but dictate other countries' companies, violation. The issue of sovereignty is one of the basic principles of the national United States to violate that. And the other point that I think is important to mention that these policies are not really working in terms of achieving their goal. They are hurting ordinary citizens in Iran. They are killing people in Iran, deprived of the medicine that we get outside, the difficulties that they have because of sanctions, limitation. ordinary citizens are getting hurt, but the objective US in terms of overthrowing the Iranian government has not been achieved. The objective of getting more concessions out of the Iranian government has not been achieved. And since the US left the agreement, as you may remember, 2018, Iran stayed in the agreement for about a year, 2019, and then gradually Iran decided to reduce its commitments under the agreement. So Iran's nuclear program is actually more advanced now than comparison had before. So if the idea was to limit Iran's nuclear program, that has obviously failed. So the objectives that were presented by the Trump administration have not materialized. So the sanctions are not effective in terms of achieving foreign policy goals. The sad news is that the Biden administration seems to like the sanctions. They like the nuclear agreement, having Iran limit its nuclear program. The part of the nuclear agreement that deals with Iran's nuclear program, they like. But the part of the agreement that limits sanctions and removes sanctions, they don't seem to like it. So generally, the situation that we have is not very good. Talks in Vienna are not achieving much so far. And the basic difficulty is that the United States wants to keep some of the sanctions that the Trump administration imposed, which is against the text of the agreement. One part of the agreement was for the US to stop the sanctioning the practices that came from the program. What the Trump administration did was to relabel some of the sanctions. For example, something Iran was sanctioned because it was related to me. They put another label on it and then they continue that sanction. Really doesn't make a difference what label you have for sanctions. What is important is whether to follow the agreement, the letter and spirit of the agreement. And that's what's lacking. So, and this is, I think, a point and example that trusting the United States government is not something that's very wise. We have representatives of other countries, foreign policy establishments of these countries. Had is that trusting the words of American politicians is not a good idea. And the political chaos that we see in the United States is this big question that whether American diplomats that are in Vienna can actually deliver on the promises that they made the negotiating table. As we speak, we have Republican senators and congressmen that threaten to tear apart whatever agreement the Biden administration reaches with Iran. We have the November elections, congressional elections. There is a good possibility that the US Congress is going to be controlled by the Republicans. And if that happens, even if there is an agreement in Vienna, there's a chance that the Republicans would cause difficulty with that agreement. And then have the 2024 presidential election, the Biden presidency, and at that time they don't talk. And so there are a lot of questions on whether we can trust American diplomats with promises that they make. The sanctions, conclude, are very complicated. It's a very complicated issue. They don't work in terms of achieving foreign policy goals, but they do work in terms of killing innocent people. So let me thank again our host, And thank you, the organizers, for organizing this important topic. And we hope to be able to see you in the future. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Joe, for taking the time to do that interview. And thank you, Foad, Izaadi, for helping us get the voice of Iran around to a much wider audience. And we need to do a lot more programs like this. We have 3 short announcements, and then I do want to ask each of our speakers to come back on with their camera and unmute. But we first want to hear from Ann Garrison, who is part of the Sanctions Kill campaign, is going to describe a little bit of what her plans are to do with today's program and has done with past programs. Joe Lombardo is going to describe a little bit of a very special report that Sanctions Kill issued and how it could have wider distribution. And Zach Kerner is going to describe a forthcoming book. But these are quite short, and I think we'll have time for some good concluding remarks and answers to questions. So Anne, please join us.
Okay, thank you. All I have to say is, excuse me, is that I hope we can all collaborate on sharing what this webinar exposes. I work on a weekly hour on the Pacifica Radio Network called COVID, Race, and Democracy that airs in New York, Washington, D.C., Houston, and Los Angeles. And we're going to start airing a 1-hour version of the webinar on February 7th. We already did a show about sanctions in which we relied heavily on the work of the Sanctions Kill Coalition. So please help us by sharing this with your lists and friends who couldn't attend. The video archive will become available on the Sanctions Kill website soon, and I think you'll get it by email, and we'll post our show, our hour-long version, to the Sanctions Kill website as well. So go out and represent.
Thank you. Okay, Joe Lombardo, I think you should come on to describe this special report.
Hello, everyone. Sorry, we've had a few technical troubles on the webinar today. I wanted to reemphasize what Anne said. Not only will you get a link to the video, that will be the YouTube video, but it's good to see it again so you can educate yourselves. But it's more important to spread it out, to put it out to your own email list, social media friends and contacts, and get this as far as we can, because sanctions are the way that they are conducting war primarily today. But the Sanctions Kill put out a really significant report where we went over various countries, what is happening in these countries with sanctions, and so that people can get a very important understanding. When the General Assembly meeting was in progress in this fall, we met with the delegation from Venezuela and presented this report. And they said they will help try to get it out to other members of the United Nations. All nations need to see this report. Additionally, we have sent it out to Congress people from throughout the country and political leaders. And you can see this report by going to the Sanctions Kill website at sanctionskill.org, read it, inform yourselves, and then get that out, just like the video that we have seen. And this video talked only about a few countries that are sanctioned, but there are over 40. And we will have other videos so that other countries can get their voice heard right here in the belly of the beast, and let people know what our media is not telling you about sanctions. Thanks.
Thank you, Joe. And next, let me ask Zach, to talk about the upcoming book.
Thanks, Sarah. So I just wanted to say a few quick words about the next project from the Sanctions Kill campaign, which we're all very excited about. And that's a book that we're publishing. It's more like an anthology of articles that have been written by activists and organizers domestically and internationally over the past few years. The book is going to focus on many of the important themes that we discussed today, which is the growing resistance to US sanctions. The subtitle of the book, at least the working subtitle, is "The World Stands Up." And in addition, we will cover some of the other countries that we, unfortunately didn't have enough time to talk about today, including Afghanistan, China, Cuba, and many others. And finally, the book will include articles that analyze sanctions through a principled anti-imperialist lens, which is to say as economic warfare, and will also include some helpful reports and toolkits for educating others about sanctions. And so we hope that the book will serve as an important resource on the true nature of US sanctions, how they have been applied to particular countries, and how those affected have been working together to resist them. So please be on the lookout for future announcements about the book. Thank you.
Thank you, Zach. And let me ask as we go to the Q&A, if you can help on the publishing of this book, if you can help us continue. There is a very important donate button. I'm going to post it in the chat. I think Joe can post it here on the site, but it's sanctionskill.org/donate. Couldn't be simpler, but it is donations. It's through IFCO, Pastors for Peace, tax exempt, People's Organization donations. So please, if you can make a donation, these donations really add up, and they just help us. How do you publish a book when publishers don't want an issue to be heard, and yet we are determined to make our voice heard? So that's at sanctionskill.org/donate. Now on the Q&A, we have so many questions that there's no way to do it. And as folks know, it's already over time. So I'm going to try to summarize, and I hope I'm doing justice on this. But there were several, and let me ask all of the speakers, the panelists today, to both come back on the screen, and also when you turn on your mics and we kind of all appear. Although try to keep background noise down. But a number of the questions asked about the destabilization along with the sanctions that the United States carries out, such as through NED programs, supposedly for democracy, USAID funded programs that while making the economy scream, at the same time they are destabilizing and funding an opposition. That's one question that in different ways went to different speakers. And I think we'll be able to hear from each of the speakers at least once round, but we want to end by 3. But there was also questions on how the US has managed to impose sanctions through the UN Security Council. And this is certainly true when we look at Korea, 70 years. When we look at Eritrea, this has been true for Iraq, for Libya, that the sanctions aren't only through all different agencies of the US Commerce Department, State Department, through the European Union, and so on, but also there are UN sanctions. Even while the United Nations General Assembly is speaking against the sanctions, or, for example, has voted overwhelmingly against the blockade of Cuba. So it's a question there about the functioning of the UN, particularly Security Council under US pressure. And the other question I can answer, there were a number of questions asking, can we rebroadcast this? Can we share it? And I think we've already dealt with that. And the answer is yes, but contact us if you want to hear it yes again. And so the only way I think to do this is turn on your mics and wave your hand to figure out some sort of order of who would like to speak. Unfortunately, we cannot bring back Foad Izaadi because you know, he was on by Skype, and that's great that we were able to at least do that. So I got to see a hand raised here, so I know in what order we want to go, but I do hope that each of the panelists today will have concluding remarks that address either those questions, or it could be another question that you saw in the chat. Everybody could look at the chat, or another closing comment you want to make. But and I hope I summarize the things I saw the most strongly coming through. Okay, good. I see Francisco Campbell. We'll take you first from Nicaragua.
In the case of Nicaragua, the 2018 coup attempt is an expression of the combination of diplomatic economic measures, all directed at trying to overthrow the government, working closely with individuals who, in effect, were on the payroll of the United States government. Basically, actors who were, in fact, operating as a foreign agent, advocating for the foreign policy of the United States, which is directed at trying to overthrow the Sandinista government in Nicaragua. So the question as to how all these various elements come together, I believe, is clearly manifested in what they tried to do in Nicaragua. And of course, the Nicaraguan people were able to rally around their government and defeated the coup attempt. But the struggle continues because the United States continue with its European allies, continue to apply pressure on Nicaragua, hoping to achieve their objective of destroying the Sandinista revolution. And that is why it is so important to have international solidarity counteracting this destabilizing campaign, and in the process trying to rid the world of this pernicious behavior by the United States and its European allies that seeks to, in effect, reinstate neo-colonial domination and countries that have really committed themselves to be free and to adopt a path that leads to development and prosperity for all of our citizens. So I believe that to get a clear understanding as to how this pernicious strategy unfolds, you could look at what happened in the case of Nicaragua with the 2018 coup attempt.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Francisco Campbell. All right, let me see another hand here. Please don't be shy. And just to say, we are planning future webinars, one of them on the shutdown and the use of social media. I believe Ann Garrison is working on that, also Jerry Condon from Veterans for Peace, and several others, but examining how Zoom, Facebook, Twitter, and many other social media platforms can work to shut down. Now, I raised some initial questions, but there may be other points that based on this panel you now have on your mind and would like to address. So let me see a next hand. If you don't, I'm gonna just call on you. Okay, is that Elias? Is that a hand?
Yes.
Okay, good. All right, we'll take you
I
next.
thought my hand was raised in the icon, but it could be wrong.
Oh, I see. Son, I'm certainly was. Excuse me.
No, it's
Go
okay. I could always raise the real hand. So yeah, I mean, I think this goes. It's a question from the Q&A section that's directly addressed to me, to Elias Amare from Marta Schmidt, and it's a very relevant question. She says, isn't the Security Council required by UN Charter Article 33 to take actions short of sanctions, exhaust all peaceful measures before it imposes coercive measures like sanctions? It seems that diplomacy and negotiated alternatives are not fully used, and this is something peace activists should demand of their governments. I completely agree with this. The UN Charter should be the basis of international law, where extreme measures like quote-unquote sanctions, but economic warfare, are imposed on countries. Only when all avenues debate through the UN Security Council are exhausted can that Chapter 7 be raised. But clearly in the case of Eritrea, as our experience showed in 2009, it was hastily run through. I mean, who can go against the empire? Again, it's the Thucydides imperial dictum: the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must, unfortunately. So a group of countries in the member countries of the United Nations, including Nicaragua, including Venezuela, Iran, North Korea, Cuba, China, Russia, and from Africa, my country, Eritrea, Angola, 22 all in all, have come up with an alliance or a group called Group of Friends in Defense of the UN Charter. They're saying hashtag UN Charter is our rules. It's not just any vague rules-based order as the Biden administration is claiming. The UN Charter should be the basis of international law. And if you clearly stick to it, economic warfare is illegal. So I agree again with Martha Schmidt for raising this important question. And this is something peace activists and the Sanctions Scale Coalition should look into. Maybe, as Malcolm X once was thinking, to bring the plight of Black people in America to the United Nations as a human rights issue. So maybe there's something under international law that should be looked into to make illegal any unilateral, economic warfare or sanctions, unless passing through rigorous examination by UN Security Council that strictly adhere to the UN Charter.
Thank you. All right. Thank you, Elias Amare. All right. Who is next here? Erica. Excellent.
So I just want to say, for North Korea, destabilization looks like constant military exercises. These military exercises are aggressive, and North Korea has no way of knowing whether they are guised for a real attack. The exercises have historically been very threatening and have had names like decapitation exercises, threatening the country's leadership. And the US doesn't just use sanctions, but it also combines it with other strategies in order to overthrow the North Korean government and, refuses to treat the country as a sovereign nation. With response to, the UN question, UN sanctions have also played a huge role in the development of North Korea. And US imposed sanctions aren't just an example of US imperialism. The US plays a role in UN sanctions as well. Collectively, both UN sanctions and unilateral US sanctions have resulted in an almost total ban on DPRK-related trade, investment, and financial transactions. And so while US sanctions date back to the start of the war around 1950, the UN Security Council has levied pretty severe multilateral sanctions since 2006 over concerns about North Korea's nuclear weapon program. And so the first generation of UN sanctions were called smart sanctions. They targeted state and party leaders by restricting the supply of weapons, missile technology, and material, and select luxury goods. In the second generation, it was created in response to the fourth North Korean nuclear test in 2016. And these are called sectoral sanctions. They were applied indiscriminately towards entire sectors of North Korea's economy, irrespective of those sectors' ties to the nuclear program. And this has had a really devastating effect on the economy, as the top export economies in North Korea were targeted, including minerals, seafood, textiles, and agricultural products. So in terms of imports, though, the resolutions also significantly limit North Korea's import of energy, ban the import of heavy machinery, industrial equipment, and transportation vehicles. And they also forbid any joint ventures with North Korean entities, which blocks off a lot of foreign investment.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Erica. All right. Carlos Ran. Yes, please.
Once again, I would like to thank everyone for allowing us to participate in this event, and of course for joining us in this conversation. I think that I just wanted to just reflect a little on the issue of the different forms of attacks. And we mentioned before that but in the case of Venezuela, at least, but I know this is the same in other countries, we have been under a hybrid war since the beginning of the Bolivarian Revolution. And that means that there's all these different types of attacks that accompany the use of the unilateral coercive measures or the sanctions. But it is always a joint effort. It's always attacking on several different fronts at the same time. What I think is important for us to reflect upon is that for some reason there's a narrative that tries to minimize sanctions as a tool and somehow sets the belief or tries to portray the belief that sanctions are somehow better than conventional war. The sanctions are different than all these other attacks, and this is what I think we should really stand against and make a lot of noise about this, because the impacts, the effects of these measures are even more devastating that sometimes that conventional confrontations. And in the same way as in conventional military confrontations, you can be affected and the whole population is affected. Well, this in the same way as sanctions have that quality. You see, a lot of the narrative coming from the State Department is that, oh, we only target certain persons, we only target certain government officials, and we don't want to hurt the people of so and so country. That's not true, because in practical terms, and this is something that people must understand, any official that carries an important role in the country and that plays a role in the country's relations with other countries or with other institutions, once they come into that list of names of people that are sanctioned, well, then you won't have there's a lot of people that for fear won't interact. So in a way, you're jeopardizing the whole relation that the country has. You're not just jeopardizing a person. It's not Carlos Ron, specifically myself. It's that I, as representative of the Venezuelan government, then my position or my tasks cannot be completed or fulfilled because I'm on a set list, and this has a terrible effect on the way countries can deal with their problems. One of the questions, for example, in the Q&A that was addressed to us was, well, the issue that comes up that the sanctions only made just showed that there was a previous situation, economic situation, that was the cause of Venezuela's economic problems and not the sanctions. Well, the thing is, first of all, I don't agree. I think the sanctions have had a very tough impact in Venezuelan economy, and we can see there's a lot of studies that have been done on the income that Venezuela has not received. We haven't received about 99%. And I'm not exaggerating with that number. 99% of the income we would receive, 4 or 5 years ago before the sanctions came into play. I mean, we would average about $54 billion a year income, and this past year we only were able to access to $600 million during the whole year, and that's because all the oil and all the products that Venezuela is not allowed to place into the international market. But to think that, stepping back a little, to think that sanctions have nothing to do with previous economic problems. Well, even if Venezuela was trying to solve problems that were stemming from, say, other causes, not sanctions, but let's say the drop of price of oil, which is something that usually, of course, affects oil producers. Well, if Venezuela needs to renegotiate debt, if Venezuela needs to go to the banks and ask for a loan, if Venezuela wants to issue a bond or sell some of its assets, it can no longer do that because of the sanctions. So you're asking Venezuela, even if the conditions were initially different from the conditions imposed by the sanctions, economic difficulties, you're asking Venezuela to solve its problems without any of the tools that are available to countries that are not under a sanctions regime. So that is a false trick, or that they try to tell people, oh, the problems have to do with previous problems. Well, the solutions are now not in our hands because precisely of the effects of what the sanctions do. In any case, sanctions have deeply hurt the Venezuela's capability not only to receive income from trade, but it has also hurt Venezuela's capability to renew it, or to do maintenance basically on its industrial production capabilities, on its oil sector. So these are terrible, terrible measures that have an impact and that do not pick and choose who they hurt. They hurt entire populations, and that is the whole point. And this is a crime against humanity. This is something that we have taken up to the International Criminal Court. We can continue to use all possible venues, but this is a crime against humanity because you're basically condemning a whole population. You're punishing a whole population in order to achieve the change of government that you desire. This is the policy of the United States now towards Venezuela and towards many of our countries. So I just thought that's something that we must reflect on and think about when we evaluate the impact of these measures.
Thank you so much, Carlos Ron. And yes, this is a crime against humanity. I'm also reminded we should bring in, and I should have raised earlier, the case of Alex Saab as a Venezuelan diplomat, literally kidnapped from a plane when it was refueled on Cabo Verde. I had an opportunity to travel to Cabo Verde in his defense. He's now in jail, in federal jail in Miami, Florida, put on trial. Why? For helping to bring food and supplies from Iran to Venezuela. So this is a threat to every diplomat, even those who are with us here today, and to every individual standing up to US sanctions. The threat of literally being snatched from a flight. It's an impediment even to every form of travel and communication. So we really need to strengthen the global link and to bring the people's movement in behind every one of these countries resisting. Deacon Yoseph, if you want to have Teferi, from Ethiopia, if you're able to turn back on your camera if you have concluding remarks, and to also remind people, if you can help us produce this very simple book, because we want to have it very inexpensively, please do connect on sanctionskill.org/donate. If you want to reproduce any of this material, you're certainly available to, or you can connect with us. If you repackage it in interesting ways, send it to us and we'll also post it on Sanctions Kill. This is how we continue to connect. And I'm shocked that there's still hundreds of viewers on, even we're 2 hours in and we got to conclude. So Deacon Yoseph, are you still here? I know that Deacon Yoseph said he might need to be off on another call, so it could be he's not still here. And I think we will conclude with this, to thank our speakers again, because this is a huge range from Korea, maybe the longest, oldest sanctions, to Ethiopia, the newest sanctions, to Venezuela, maybe the most numerically, and Iran. I think maybe that even Iran beats Venezuela on the number of sanctions. Eritrea so long on the sanctions, and Nicaragua new vicious sanctions against such a small country. So let's stand increasingly together, and we will continue to address other sanctioned countries, campaigns, and how we continue this work. So thank you all very much for being here today. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Solidarity.
Yes.
La lucha continua.
La lucha continua. That's so true.
Thank you very much. La lucha continua, and justice will prevail.
And justice will prevail. Yes. Thank you.
Arwat nahafash, as we say in Eritrea, victory to the masses.
That is true. And increasing resistance is a powerful weapon. Bye-bye.
Yes.